Christianity differs from other religions because it's based on a historical claim of a public miracle. The Apostle Paul says that if Christ hasn't risen from the dead, the Christian faith is worthless. Since the resurrection is a historical claim, it's subject to historical investigation. And in order to argue for a historical claim, we need to do a couple of things. For starters, we need to survey the relevant facts, and then we need to examine competing explanations of those facts. First, let's take a look at some background evidence. Number one, Jesus was crucified. We have reports of Jesus' crucifixion in the Gospels and Paul's writings. It's also mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. Scholar E.P. Sanders lists this as one of the almost indisputable facts about Jesus' life. This goes against the Muslim claim found in the Quran that Jesus never died. Second, there's the burial of Jesus. Jewish law required burial, even for foreigners and executed criminals, and we do have some archaeological evidence of a crucifixion victim being buried. Archaeologist Jody Magnus says, "I believe that the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence." With that bit of stage setting out of the way, we're going to look at 5 different facts. These should be really easy to remember and share with others because they form an acrostic, A.L.I.V.E, which I'm borrowing from philosopher Tim McGrew. These facts are A. Appearances, L. Low status of women, I. Immediate proclamation, V. Voluntary sufferings, and E. Empty tomb. Now before we dive in, what are some of the rival explanations? Well, either the disciples were deceived into believing Jesus rose again, perhaps they had some really wild hallucinations, or they deceived others into thinking that he rose again. It could all be some kind of elaborate hoax. Or the disciples were telling the truth, Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. First, let's look at A. Appearances. After Jesus' resurrection, 11 disciples, the original 12 minus Judas, claimed to have seen him. These 11 disciples' experiences of seeing and speaking with the risen Jesus took place in an atmosphere of fear for their own safety and grief, rather than some kind of expectation or emotional excitement. These disciples, specifically Thomas, reportedly reacted with open skepticism to others' accounts. And in Matthew's account, some followers of Jesus also doubted even upon initially seeing him. All accounts describe the disciples' initial reactions as anything but expecting visions or being receptive to the idea that Jesus was really alive. These reported experiences were not brief and confusing episodes, but were public, multi-sensory, and extended across time. As New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams writes, "The resurrected Jesus is recorded as appearing in Judea and in Galilee, in town and in the countryside, indoors and outdoors, in the morning and the evening, by prior appointment and without prior appointment, close and distant, on a hill and by a lake, to groups of men and groups of women, to individuals and in groups up to 500, sitting, standing, walking, eating, and always talking." These appearances were reportedly extended across a period of 40 days and also involved Jesus inviting people to touch him. These kind of appearances described here sharply cut against the hallucination theory. In addition, we need to consider Jesus' appearance to Paul. Paul was a zealous Pharisee bent on persecuting the church. As an explanation for his dramatic change of heart, Paul gave the well-known account of an auditory and visual experience on the Damascus Road. He said he saw a bright light, saw Jesus, and spoke with him. Paul said that Jesus asked him why he was persecuting him, then told him to go to Damascus and await further instructions. This vision also had some intersubjective aspects, as Paul's companions heard a voice but didn't see anyone. From that point on, Paul preached that Jesus was the Messiah and was risen from the dead. His mission was endorsed by the apostles Peter, James, and John, and they also accepted him as an apostle. The elementary creed found in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 summarizes Paul's gospel. He writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." The majority of scholars, even many liberal scholars, trace this creed to the Jerusalem church and date it to the early 30s. There are many arguments that this creed didn't originate with Paul. The most popular is that the use of delivered and received in 1 Corinthians 15:3, and then the rhythmic structure and parallelisms in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7. The most popular theory is that Paul received this tradition while in Damascus, possibly from Ananias or the other Christians there, and that would place it within 1 to 3 years of Jesus' death. However, I should note that there are several other later possibilities Paul may have received this creed as well. This passage nevertheless has evidential value because it provides confirmation that the resurrection claim started with the apostolic eyewitnesses themselves. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann writes, "The elements in this tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE. This means that the resurrection was the original claim of the disciples and not some later legend. So far, things aren't looking so good for the mythic theory." Next up, let's talk about the low estimation of women. You might think that it's an odd fact, but in a patriarchal society, women were not regarded very highly. Here are some noteworthy examples. There's a prayer for an unborn child that says, "O God, let not my offspring be a girl, for very wretched is the life of women." Or there's a mourning prayer. The men blessed God and said, "Who has not made me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman?" There's further sayings like, "Let no man talk to a woman in the street, no, not even his wife." And the Rabbi Eleazar said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than committed to women." Furthermore, a female's testimony wasn't to be anywhere near the level of a testimony of a man. Just as one sampling, there's Josephus who writes, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of their levity and boldness of their sex." There's many more quotes that I can multiply here. Go ahead and visit isjesusalive.com and I will have more listed out there if you want to see them. Lastly, Luke says of the women's report of the empty tomb to the disciples, "And these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them." Peter and John did check the tomb out for themselves, but Luke's gospel makes it clear that they thought that the women's testimony was unreliable. This attitude towards testimony of women is unsurprising in the light of the legal situation we've described here. But we also found that, in spite of that, the Gospels report that women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb of Jesus. If you're going to make up a myth or you're hatching some sort of conspiracy, you're probably not going to use the testimony of women to make your case. The 2nd century pagan critic Celsus mocked Christianity for this very thing, and why would this group of women join a hoax like this against their own interests? It just doesn't make sense. Moving on, let's look at I, immediate proclamation. The disciples stayed in Jerusalem even when the church came under heavy persecution. This speaks volumes because the resurrection was proclaimed in the very city where Jesus was crucified. For the disciples to preach this so soon after Jesus' judicial murder that their religious leaders set up was to invite the same type of persecution. They could have waited until things calmed down, but they didn't. Peter went from denying that he ever knew Jesus to boldly proclaiming his resurrection just 50 days after Jesus was murdered. Occasionally, the report of a miracle may be allowed to pass without inspection, especially if it's located very far from the place where it was proclaimed and long after it allegedly happened. In contrast, in the case of the resurrection, it was announced on the spot in Jerusalem. The enemies of Christianity had the means, motive, and opportunity to discredit the story if they could. Instead, as a result of the disciples' preaching, thousands of people left their Jewish practices of worship at the temple, started worshiping on Sunday instead of on the Sabbath, and were no longer offering animal sacrifices and started a whole new way of life. They also gave up their belief in a conquering Messiah that would save them from Rome. Something very big was happening, to say the least. Because of the time and place that the message was preached, we can't say that the resurrection was a late developing legend. And given the hostile environment, it makes it difficult to say that the whole thing was a carefully crafted conspiracy for which they had everything to lose and little to nothing to gain. Next, let's look at V, Voluntary Sufferings. Here's Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid on the importance of their sufferings, and I quote, "The apostles were willing to suffer for their faith. This is certainly true of Paul, who recounts the suffering he endured, which included being whipped, beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, near starvation, and in dangers from various people and places. Speaking for the apostles after being threatened by the religious leaders, Peter and John say, 'For we cannot but speak what we have seen and heard.' The apostles are then thrown into prison, beaten for their faith, but they continue to preach and teach the gospel. This does not prove that the resurrection was true, but it does show the depth of the apostles' convictions. They were not liars. They truly believed Jesus rose from the grave and were willing to give their lives for it. Now, it's not uncommon for people to risk their lives for false beliefs. However, they generally don't do so for something they know to be false unless they think there is a moderate shot of an earthly reward that makes it worth the risk. Offering people something concrete here and now is the best way to start a false cult. Christianity promoted purity and self-control and downplayed earthly power and wealth. Its earliest preachers lived by these principles, unlike what we see from some modern preachers today. It's for this reason that no respectable scholar in academia is an advocate of the conspiracy theory, and the record we have of their suffering cuts against the mythic theory. For if the disciples weren't preaching that a crucified man rose from the dead, what exactly did they suffer for? Finally, let's look at E, empty tomb. We have a tacit confession from the Jewish leadership that the tomb was empty as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 28:12-13 says, "After the priests had assembled the elders and agreed on a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, 'Say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping.' this story continued for some time. Writing around 150 AD, Justin Martyr wrote that the story was still being spread in his day. Quote, his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he was risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. We've already discussed that the earliest witnesses to the empty tomb of Jesus were women, and how that's an unlikely Christian invention. Because women were not counted trustworthy witnesses in Jesus' time, the fact that the gospel writers included these embarrassing details of the women being the witnesses to the empty tomb shows the improbability of the empty tomb narratives being invented. Now, someone at this point might ask, well, what if the women just went to the wrong tomb and were deceived? In response, it's unlikely that a whole group of women went to the wrong tomb, because according to Luke, they saw it on the eve of the Sabbath. This theory does nicely account for the report of the empty tomb, since on this hypothesis, the tomb to which they actually went was truly empty, but the wrong tomb hypothesis doesn't consider all the other details in the women's reports. For their claim of having seen the risen Jesus, or for the apostles' failure to clear up the situation, and for the failure of the Jewish authorities to clarify the issue, especially Joseph of Arimathea, who was on the Council of the Sanhedrin. Now, there has been some speculation that Joseph of Arimathea simply temporarily buried Jesus' body in his own tomb before moving it on Saturday night after the Sabbath was over to bury it in a common graveyard for criminals, leaving the women to discover an empty tomb on Sunday morning. But this hypothesis has some serious issues. It's hard to fathom why Joseph of Arimathea would provide a new tomb for Jesus' body immediately after his death, and then remove it as quickly as possible after the Sabbath, and then not clear up the matter after the apostles started preaching the resurrection. Furthermore, this theory can't explain the women's claims that they actually saw Jesus. There's a lot more that I could say here, but I'll leave it here for now. Simply put, the women were not deceived. When something can be explained without difficulty by supposing that a miracle occurred, but not without larger implausibility by assuming a miracle did not occur, that is evidence for a miracle. This is just basic Bayesian reasoning. Now, let's think about this for just a moment further. What's the most likely thing to happen when somebody dies? What occupies the most probability space, so to speak? Well, the answer is nothing. No grief hallucinations, no visions, no apparitions, no conspiracies about someone being raised from the dead, no stolen bodies or reburials. Now let's think a little bit further about 1st century Palestine. According to Josephus, there were several messianic figures during this time that drew large followings. We also know of other miracle workers and so-called prophets. What happened to these people when they died? Well, exactly what we would expect. They eventually lost their following, and no one claimed that they were alive afterward. No visions, no hallucinations, no empty tombs, bupkis, crickets. These alternative explanations already have a low probability built into them. And on top of that, we see that they don't work very well. If they're already really unlikely, combining several other of them together to get a solution to explain all the data is just multiplying improbability upon improbability. On the other hand, Christianity very neatly explains all the relevant data. Finally, the argument here admittedly assumes that the Gospels are historically reliable and rooted in eyewitness testimony. In other words, we trust them as much as any ordinary document of secular history. And where the documents do recall miracles like Jesus' resurrection appearances, I assume that they're authentic, meaning they describe what the disciples testified to have witnessed. If this assumption is false, then the evidence for the resurrection I've shared is severely limited. I'm upfront about that. Having said that, I'm not begging any questions here. This channel is primarily dedicated to defending that the Gospels and Acts are trustworthy accounts. So be sure to subscribe and also check out my other videos for more.